In a world where points depend on hinges,
there are hinge points inside us all.
History on a Segway.
It's overdetermined.
We are the points that our hinges have been seeking.
What this podcast asks is, what if?
Agriculture, fail or epic win?
What if it was Johnny Vango Pit?
What if the Ottomans had AK-47s?
Maybe climate change was a good idea.
What if the Ottomans had lightsabers?
What if the buffalo killed us?
What if Santa Claus was real, like an actual guy who gave presents every year? This is Hinge Points.
Hello, Prestige heads, and welcome to American Prestige. I'm Danny Bessner, here as always with my friend and comrade Derek Davison, and we're excited to welcome to the pod returning champion Matt Christman, one of our first guests, one of our most beloved returning guests, and first time, long time, I'm talking on his behalf, Chris Wade. Thanks so much for joining us, guys.
Hello, glad to be here.
I refer to you two as the Hellboys. The Hellboys are in the house.
We are indeed the Hellboys.
So everyone probably knows, listening to this podcast, but Matt and Chris a couple of years ago did a very interesting series called Hell of Presidents, and now they're doing a new great series on the 30 Years' War, an extraordinarily important topic to the history of capitalism, nationalism, and everything about why the world is the way it is on the 30 Years' War, called Hell on Earth. So, guys, before we get into it, because we're going to do a little hinge points on this show to sort of shake things up a bit, why this topic? What drew you to it after doing the President show? What drew you to European history? And, you know, a relatively arcane subject, perhaps, for the ordinary American, or dare I say, the ordinary Chapo listener.
Well, the fact that it's arcane is one of the things that drew us to it, because it's a very important, crucial era that is relatively untrod ground in terms of pop history or popular culture. So we thought we could get stuff out of it that nobody was going to have encountered before. And the more we looked into it, the more we saw the striking parallels between that moment and ours, the crisis that unfolded, and also what was birthed by that crisis, the specific forms of economic and political power that persisted to eventually dominate the globe.
Yeah, exactly. And, we thought, with no particular destination in mind, that perhaps by looking into this particular moment that we could find some, ways of looking at our current moment that would put a sharper lens onto the crisis that we're going through in this moment. Moment. I love moments.
We love a moment, don't we?
Yes.
The Hellboys love moments. This just in. One of the most interesting things is sort of the importance of this war for the history of international relations and IR. So could you maybe talk a little bit about that? That why is this moment so important, not only for the formation of capitalism as a global phenomenon, but for literally the formation of this thing that we call the international system, which has dominated thinking about international politics for almost 500 years at this point?
It really is the post-Reformation era that sees the formation of the first alliance blocks, like that we would recognize in the modern sense, among the powers of Europe. The transition away from just one group of cousins going after another one, based solely on claims to territory and ancestral rights and forged documents. You have this ideologically coherent alliance of states or proto-states working together to try to assert a broad prerogative against another bloc. And that's first emerges among the early Protestant countries resisting the Counter-Reformation. And then by the early 1700s, you have this well-formed structure. Of course, the funny thing is that the loads the keystone of the Protestant alliance, and the bank for the whole Protestant cause is Catholic France, which speaks to the fact that even though this is a religious alliance and these are religious conflicts, there's still the real generating friction is dynastic power struggles. And that's something that France is incredibly precocious about. They're the first country in Europe to really transcend religion as a modus vivendi, because even in the 1500s, they're allying with the Sultan, the Ottoman Turks against the Habsburgs.
And that's the thing that makes the 30 Years' War particularly brutal and interesting, is that it starts off as essentially this domestic conflict within the Holy Roman Empire around these confessional alliances. And the thing that makes it brutal is the fact that it very quickly escapes the boundary of the Holy, such as it were, of the Holy Roman Empire, and becomes a international power struggle that happens to be waged in the lands of the Holy Roman Empire. And that's the thing that makes it not a 3 years war, but a 30 years war, as various entities keep trying to hash out their international disputes on the war-torn lands of central Germany.
Do you guys think something like that was inevitable? Is there a world where you don't get the rise of the nation state and capitalism in formation with each other, basically after colonialism? Just to put it in a distinct way, could we still, in theory, be living in a world organized along confessional lines as opposed to national lines? Or is this an inevitable function of the transformation in the political economic base of society?
I think that technology is usually what pushes social change, and the explosion of technological progress that happens alongside the demographic explosion of the early modern era. I think it undermines any long-term religious framework for politics and for society. As for capitalism specifically and the nation state, maybe if the Turks took Vienna, I've thought about that a little bit. If the Ottomans had been a more,
if spring in the Balkans had been less rainy,
yeah, exactly,
they've been able to get their cannons.
If they got those dang cannons across the mud, and Vienna becomes the western capital of the Ottoman Empire, that proximate danger might have forced Europe into subsuming their dynastic differences and religious differences. And becoming the universal monarchy that the Habsburgs sought it to be. But we saw pretty conclusively historically that the capacity to do that just doesn't exist for any outside force in Europe, which means that these medium states are going to keep fighting each other until they create these mechanisms that are perfected basically in the fight with each other.
One thing I was also thinking about, when we were setting outlines around for this episode, is also because so much of this period is a dynastic struggle between France and the Habsburgs, that maybe there is a different formation that is played out more directly than indirectly that causes France itself to be further alienated from the Central Catholic Church, and maybe that there is a different confessional alliance in which French Catholicism becomes a wholly different thing than Habsburg and Papal Catholicism, and that forms a different, axis of orientation around powers. I don't know.
Yeah, like a French Anglicanism.
Yes, exactly.
I want to ask sort of a variation on Danny's question with a bit of a different direction. But first of all, I want to say, Matt, I was so gratified. I think it was in episode 2 to find out that you had seen the Orson Welles Nostradamus documentary.
Oh, yeah, The Man Who Saw Tomorrow.
I thought I dreamed that at one point. Like, there was a period of my life where Orson Welles was the Nostradamus guy. Like, I didn't know him as anything else.
I think that movie caused more existential crises among little kids.
Oh, it was terrifying. Yeah, it's like,
it's literally telling you. First of all, look at all these amazing predictions he had. And then he says the world is going to end in the 90s. There's going to be a nuclear war that you're going to be alive for.
It was really terrifying. But my question, listening to the first part of this episode, it's the first part of your series, it's shocking how quickly this religious reform movement stop being about religion or salvation or even church governance. It became about nations and inheritance and basic politics. And I'm curious, having looked at the Reformation to prepare for this, do you think the Reformation would have been what it was had there not been the Habsburgs there for these princes to be reacting against and creating this sort of political struggle?
I mean, it definitely motivated the princes. It gave them a real reason to cultivate the Reformation in their territories, because it gave them this leverage against a threatening, overweening Habsburg authority. But the original burst of Reformation occurs in the cities almost spontaneously as people encounter the printed text of Luther's critique. And you see the imperial free cities and larger towns sort of creating their own religious models. And if there hadn't been a Habsburg to give a motivation to the princes to ally with that, then that would have had to have been suppressed one way or the other. And that kind of conflict, I think, if it had happened, probably would have pushed the Reformation west, because the one thing that united the Reformation across Western Europe is that its immediate brushfire popularity anywhere that you had an urban population. So it probably does not achieve the magisterial element that it got, and you don't have the great power politics dominating it, but some ferment is inevitable, I think, as soon as those first pamphlets go out. And the thing about Frederick the Wise is protection of Luther is that a lot of it had to do with his desire to have electoral Saxony appear as a place for scholarship, learning, and the sophisticated urban life that until that point wasn't really known for.
I think the corollary or inverse to that question is also, if the Reformation had not happened at the time that it did, in the course that it did, in the place that it did, would there have been some other mechanism by which the princes of the Holy Roman Empire would have tried to assert formally and together, unifiedly, some form of increased independence from the empire and the emperor, which seems like something that would have happened, maybe not on the same timescale. And I think we're going to get into this in a little bit, but with that these things worked together as an ideological component and a political component, that is the history that we have. But it seems like both would have happened independently of each other some way, most likely over the course of the 17th century, due to the material factors that we lay out, things like the Little Ice Age and the crisis of agricultural production.
Yeah, that happens no matter what. That has to be reminded. Like the Little Ice Age and the attended collapse in agriculture, that's baked in no matter what contingents occur.
Before we get into the hinge points themselves, I just wanted a final question. How do you think this story relates to the rise of Western Europe vis-a-vis Eastern Europe within sort of European and then global history? Because if you look at, the previous 500 years, there's no reason to think that it would be France and Britain and Germany that would emerge from European history as the dominant powers. Why not Eastern Europe? Why not these Austrian kingdoms and later Austro-Hungary? Do you think that this has anything to play into that?
Well, I mean, I think Eastern Europe is sort of off the table just demographically. The population density isn't sufficient to have the kind of ferment that occurs, the rubbing together, the pushing, the struggle that you see in Western Europe. And I think Austria, Germany, they're fundamentally too far from the trade routes that end up extending westward, because it really is in North and South America that the future of European domination is forged.
There was also an issue in Eastern Europe that there's just like a slightly but noticeably different feudal relationship that developed there. A more independent peasantry, a less centralized aristocracy that I think we don't really touch on in this series that much, but is necessary to know why they are in a different developmental trajectory than Western Europe.
So now let's get into the hinge points and let's have a little fun with it. It's going to be a grab bag like we did on the Napoleon episode on the Chapo feed. But why don't we start with hinge point number 1? Henry IV of France is not assassinated. And before we get in, why don't you let people know who the hell is Henry IV of France? Why is he important? And if he isn't assassinated, how does that change the trajectory of everything that comes after?
So Henry IV was had been the leader of the Huguenot forces during the War of the Three Henries, the violent religious wars that racked France in the late 16th century. But once the Valois line died out after the assassination of Henry III by another Catholic fanatic, he converts to Catholicism, famously but not accurately saying Paris is worth a mass. Becomes the king and knits together the Protestant and most of the moderate Catholic forces within France, really only leaving the alienated, the most ultra-Catholics. And as a Catholic king of France, he orients himself towards neutralizing the Habsburgs. That had been the goal of French foreign policy for generations at that point. And as part of that, he was in the process in the around 1609, 1610, of negotiating with the forces of the Palatinate, the Calvinist electorate of the Holy Roman Empire, that will end up 7 years later plunging the country into war by accepting the Bohemian crown. Henry was in negotiations with them for a coordinated invasion of Germany to settle one of the succession disputes that were occurring at the periphery of the empire and were sharpening the confessional conflict within it and undermining Protestant faith in the Habsburg emperors as fair adjudicators of conflicts. And his assassination basically cancels that operation. But there was a plan for a full French invasion of Germany there in 1610. So if Ravaillac does not get him, then that would have happened, and the entire conflict the contours of it would have been drastically changed. Because while France was very happy to fund everybody who wanted to fight the Habsburgs in the first half of the war, there is no direct French intervention until after the death of Gustavus Adolphus in the 1630s. And then the whole war the back half of the war becomes this miserable slog as the French and the Habsburgs try to bleed each other out. And if Henry had not died, then that happens much earlier, and the early confessional crisis is essentially preempted. So I don't know if that would have, but the thing is, I don't know if that would have led for greater bloodshed or less. My suspicion is it would have sort of pricked the balloon. And
right, it ends it earlier, basically, right?
Exactly.
So you don't get sort of the permanent wartime, decades-long thing if they just go in at the very beginning and end it. Sorry, Chris, you were going to say
go in at the beginning. I mean, the idea was the goal was to reduce the Habsburg influence over the lands of Germany, basically, and the power of the emperor relative to the constituent princes. And that was not something the Habsburgs were going to take easily, but it might have occurred earlier to people that neither one of those sides was going to get the full result they wanted, and some sort of negotiated climb down might have been possible much earlier.
Because then you would see, like, just looking at the actual course of the war, what I imagine then is you would see all the peripheral princes who are, constantly griping about, princely privileges and prerogatives, who, start the rebellion in the 30 Years' War, would probably ally with France and form become the lesser partners of a larger, invasion alliance, rather than being the main fighters of a proxy war that France is funding. So you have a larger, more led by a more dominating force, able to coordinate power from the top through France alliance that would bring together, more participants to a more powerful military alliance earlier. they could set up a more full confrontation sooner, and possibly create a shorter, more decisive battle. Like, who would win that could still be up in the air, but because then you would also have surely like intervention from the Spanish on behalf of the German Habsburgs, but it would probably be more like a 10 years war than a 30 years war or something like that.
Do you still think you get the state system formalized in the Treaty of Westphalia if something like this happens way earlier? Because that, to me, is the big question. If you don't get the decades-long war and basically all of Europe coming to be like, we don't want to do this again, we need to actually codify some proto-form of international law effectively, right? This is what Westphalia is usually pointed to as like the first glimmer of there's going to be norms and rules across borders. But is that dependent on 20 more years of war? Because that leads to the question, let's say it ends in 10 years. Does something else happen in 70 years where you get a Westphalia, but it's, in 100 years as opposed to 1648?
And it worked. They never did it again. It was
thank God.
Never, nothing ever happened again.
I do think that the array of forces is such, especially given the crisis conditions, that some sort of transformation was going to occur on the ground, and that at some point that transformation was going to be recognized diplomatically, which is really what Westphalia is. It's not the imposition of a system. It is the recognition of a transformation that had happened sort of underneath the feet of everybody without anyone really pushing for it or trying to make it happen in the first place.
Related to this, and then we'll move on to the next hinge point, I'm curious what you guys think about the importance of intellectual innovations. That someone like Hugo Grotius, really the first modern theorist of international war, is writing in relation to the outbreak of the war. What role do you think intellectual transformations, which a ton of them happened during the 30 Years' War? I mean, you could point to even Grimmelshausen when we're talking about aesthetics as really the first picaresque novel. The first Zelig of history is during the 30 Years' War. You get Grotius writing about international law. Do you guys think these sorts of intellectual currents are actually channeling the material forces in particular ways? Or do you think they're kind of epiphenomenal and reacting to as opposed to shaping events?
I do think that they begin as a reaction to events and an attempt to, especially when you talk like a guy like Grotius, an attempt to justify a political formation that he is part of. And that all the intellectual energy flows from that goal. But once that happens, once that's out there, then it becomes the basis for future people to respond to and to be shaped by. But I do think that it is a result of the actions on the ground that like initially make these things spring up, and then only later can you point to those intellectual developments as things that can meaningfully influence events. But they do at that point.
And we'll talk about this in one of our appendix episodes, the kind of relationship between thinkers, advisors, court advisors, and the patronage system, that everything is being, or most thinking of this is being done under the auspices or the search for patronage, usually from the ruling party, whoever is in power at that moment. So it is this relationship between all these people who have some kind of insight into what is happening in the moment, and a lot of new ways of describing, but also a lot written in the context of who is in power is going to want to hear me saying these things. So it is a combination of insight and flattery to what people want to hear that is being a lot of the intellectual output of this time. Would you agree, Matt?
Oh yeah, definitely.
Another thing I find so interesting about the 30 Years' War is that when it pops up as an important metaphor for people like after it, and the last 30 Years' War explosion was really during like the 50s and the 60s. That's when Grimmelshausen first gets translated into English, I believe, at least on a mass scale, and it becomes this referential space for people who think they're living through liminal moments. It'll be interesting, in 50 years when people look back on this, they'll be like, why were they attracted to the 30 Years' War? And what was going on then?
Really the one that really clicked it into place was for us more than anything, I think, was the for me the two elements of climate change, which is something that, is essential to this moment and is essential to our moment. And then the elements that we can talk of that are a financial collapse that is going across Europe in this moment, and also the information revolution that is so much of a part of this, that is, changing the way that subjects relate to their sovereign. And I can totally, the thing in the 40s and 50s that people were very interested in, makes a lot of sense because of,
it was total wars. It was total war. That's what 30s war, first total war.
Yeah, we just did another war that lasted 30 years, mostly across Central Europe. I wonder what this reminds me of. And, so that makes total sense. But it is, these resonant themes that we have talked about over and over on, basically every time we talk about this show, that, I think makes it fairly obvious why we would want to discuss it again at this moment. And are themes that would not be immediately obvious any time before, say, 2008, let's say.
It's really one of those foundational moments of modernity. So let's move on now to the second hinge point, which deals with the third of the three defenestrations of Prague. People are always getting thrown out of windows in Prague.
In the fashion. There's a description of it where someone says he was thrown out of the window in the local fashion. Like that was understood to be just the thing that they did.
We were reading something
really
from a generation, again, something that will come up in an appendix. We were reading something from a generation before this about basically a Catholic inquisitor of heresies being so annoyed by somebody that they were interviewing in Prague that they said, I wish I could have thrown him out of a window. So it's like in the back of everybody's mind in Prague at any time there's always the window option.
There's always a chance.
Yes.
My thing is, like, for life advice, find someone who loves you as much as people in Prague love throwing people out of windows.
And also don't stand by a window in Prague.
Yes, exactly. Don't find yourself between someone you have beef with in a window in Prague.
So what was the defenestration of Prague, and what happens if that window is boarded up or someone decides to close it that day and he just smashes into it as opposed to tumbling out the castle wall, as it were?
Well, the defenestration was the ritual window chuck of three representatives of the emperor by the Protestant city fathers of Prague, who were in the process of overthrowing their king, who was also about to be made Holy Roman Emperor, Ferdinand II. And this event is what ensures that there's going to be a violent conflict between, at the very least, the Bohemians and the empire. I don't think it really matters so much whether if there's a defenestration. Like, there was going to be some sort of violent conflict at that point. The electors of Bohemia they were motivated, they were organized, they had the capacity, they believed themselves to be capable of winning a conflict with the emperor. So they were going to make some sort of show of that no matter what. Even if the window was boarded up, they might have just stabbed him to death. Who knows? Even though that would have been very tacky and uncheck of them. I think the real question is if it really is the decision of the Palatine elector, Frederick V, to take the offered crown when they offer it to him that guarantees that the war is going to be what it is. And that is a similarly kind of fixed situation because the entire court around Frederick had convinced themselves for a while that they were the force that was going to bring about the final confrontation with Catholic heresy, and had built what they thought was a stable and meaningfully powerful political and economic and diplomatic alliance among different Protestant powers to bring that about.
So then by that point, you're basically saying that some spark was going to be found regardless.
Yeah. And what we get in history is the particular form of it, which is particular to those weirdos who love throwing people out of windows, out of religious devotion, because the first defenestration helped spark the Hussite War.
So what could have changed by that moment effectively? Because essentially that second hinge point, the argument is that this thing is going to get pop off no matter what. So what had happened to that point where you think some sort of conflict was inevitable? By 1617, let's say 1618, there's going to be a 30 years war. Is that what you're effectively saying? And if so, could you explain why?
There's some sort of conflict with, at the very least, Bohemia, because they were set on rejecting Ferdinand II as the king, and that was not something that the Habsburgs were going to be able to allow to happen.
I guess the question there is whether it becomes a empire-wide conflagration. Yeah, as you said, like the real hinge is, the court of Frederick V of the Palatinate, and if that doesn't happen, does any other force come to the aid of?
Yeah, what if he doesn't take the crown? What do you think happens if he doesn't take the crown?
Because they shop the crown around to a lot of people, and nobody else was psycho. Yes, that sounds like a bad idea. Yeah. You guys take care of it yourself.
But I mean, it had to there was going to be conflict because the king of Bohemia was the essentially tie-breaking vote among the electors of the Holy Roman Emperor, because there were three secular Protestant electors at that point, and then the three Catholic prince bishops, and the seventh vote was the Bohemian king. So the future of the imperial crown was really in the balance there with who became king of Bohemia, which is also an electoral title. So yeah, conflict is inevitable. If there's nobody to take the crown, though, then the Bohemians probably just get rinsed pretty quickly, and everyone tries to just pretend it never happened, which I think is certainly what John George of Saxony, who was the chief Lutheran elector, would have preferred.
So what happens then? No one takes the crown. They get rinsed. Is there not this conflagration? Or again, is it happening no matter what? Because this is really interesting from a Marxist perspective, because it allows you to really identify what are the crucial factors.
I think that a conflict is inevitable, just because every power within the continent is going to be forced by the same matrix of crises to try to aggrandize themselves. And it is that struggle that pulls up out of the earth all of these innovations against, that no one is planning, no one is seeking, but which are emergent and necessary to facilitate this conflict.
I mean, other things to consider, like, so if the Bohemian Revolt is just crushed pretty quickly, it's the Winter Revolt or something. In my mind, what we return to then is the main conflict between Habsburgs and France, and then the other thing that I think of is what happens with the 80 Years' War with the Dutch if the full force of the Habsburg, the two sides of the Habsburg Empire can really focus on that. Does the Dutch become the international cause of the Protestant alliance and the wedge against the Habsburgs? Does France, as it eventually does it intervene directly in the Spanish Netherlands to support the Dutch cause? Do the Dutch make a separate alliance with the Protestant princes of the Holy Roman Empire, and does that become a fulcrum of conflict within the Holy Roman Empire? As if the Protestant princes are forming their own international policy of aid against the Dutch, does it just shift to who is the wedge that all the anti-Habsburg international forces are using to try to subvert Habsburg power?
And then how does that affect Spanish colonialism? Do you get, Latin American revolutions 150 years before you do, because Spain is now much more concentrating on what's happening in their northwestern frontier than they would be otherwise?
I don't think that would necessarily have occurred, just because the Spanish administration in the New World was very much organized around facilitating the creation of a basically independent new nobility in the Americas. Because that was the easiest way to do it. It was the way that required the least amount of infrastructure to carry out. And as a result, over time, less and less of the silver of the New World made its way to Spain at all, because they were the local rulers were able to just keep as much really as they wanted. And if there's less, even less oversight in the New World, I think that makes even less motivation for the locals to resist. It's really not until the revolts in Latin America happen are sparked by an attempt to reorganize and rationalize the colonial administration and to increase central authority and oversight. And as long as that wasn't happening, the local elites in Latin America were happy to stay as part of the Spanish Empire.
Right. It's that shock at the imperial core with the French invasion and changing, putting Joseph on the throne and changing the administration of the colonies that really sparks that.
Yeah. What do you think of the Dutch question then, Matt?
I think that's where, if it's inevitable as we're saying it is, then the question is where will the spark be? And if there is a full-scale attempt to retake the Low Countries after the 12 years truce ends, then there's every motivation for France and England, for that matter, to come around to the defense of the Dutch, which means, the conflict will happen somewhere. And that's as good a possibility as anywhere.
So is that ultimately an argument about capitalism's inevitability? And the reason that I ask that is, do you think that if it is inevitable, it could have taken a different form?
I don't know. It's a question, like capitalism becomes inevitable at a certain point. I don't think you can deny that. But until that point, it isn't. Because of the shifting sands of time and history and the fact that the form of capitalism that we get is so specifically contextualized in England, It is the agricultural revolution in England that creates the form of capitalism attached to a state structure to facilitate it. And if that's that contingent geographically, it's hard to say that at any point it has to happen. But at some point, nothing is going to impede it from developing as part of this conflict matrix with the states of Europe.
Well, could you get a Catholic capitalism as opposed to a Protestant capitalism? I think that's what I'm trying to ask, because that would have different features and a different tenor than the one that the sort of Calvinist-infused Anglo-American dominant capitalism. You could think of a Spanish Franco capitalism, which will still be capitalism, but would have a different vibe.
I don't think so, because of, as I said, the geographic fixedness of it. The places that the capitalist structures emerge are north of a certain latitude, and those places become hegemonically Protestant in the 16th century.
I think one of the arguments that we'll also try to make in this series is that kind of the language, the ideological structures that buttress and give shape to what will become English capitalism are developed in the lowlands at this time, in Amsterdam, among the very specific Calvinist nature of the Dutch trade empire of this time. And all of these social structures that give rise to it and give shape to how a political structure can be created, are forged in this fight for Protestant independence at this time. I think, again, like the specific shape of what we have has to come from the history that we know, and that's based around these ideological innovations of Protestantism and the Protestant Revolution. It really depends, because as we said in another hinge point, there is a version of history in which Henry VIII, instead of doing the English Reformation, is a Catholic defender throughout his entire reign. And does that mean that England never goes Protestant, or it develops its own English Catholicism like French Catholicism exists?
Right.
Possibly, but still
this is the Weberian thesis,
yeah.
right? Like the Weberian thesis is that the Calvinism and the the Calvinism and the capitalism kind of go together. But it's an interesting mind experiment.
But like it's not just like because of idealism. Like in the case of England, it is the material reality of the expropriation of church lands in England that becomes a material force, this new land that is put onto the market, and essentially a agreement where the landed class give over the political power that came with their access to those church lands through its offices to the crown in exchange for the economic power of having direct access to this land. And it's those lands that become the places where the capitalist forms of social production really start taking off. So you have a religious innovation that leads to a material transition that then becomes an engine for fundamental social shifts.
So this is a question that emerges from angles before we get to the final hinge point. Do you think there was a moment during the 30 Years' War, you guys are way more familiar with it than I am, where you could have had a type of Bauernkrieg or a peasants' war where the quote-unquote masses try to seize control from this thing that's being directed from top down? Or is that not really possible? Because I believe from what I recall, there's some writing in Angles that he's like, that could have happened in a way where you could, even before capitalism is like fully developed, you could have in theory had a more controlled version of it if there was some sort of resistance from the ground up. Or in your reading, have you found that really just wasn't possible for various reasons?
Well, there were tons of peasant revolts, specifically during the early stages of the war. There were peasant revolts in Austria, in Moravia, Silesia. There were spontaneous eruptions of peasant resistance to the conflict on religious grounds generally, but they were universally defeated in particular just because the war was throwing up these massive mercenary armies that had the capacity to run down rebellion wherever it erupted. And the peasants had no more capacity to organize independently than they had 100 years ago during the peasant war of the 1620s, because the peasantry are the last to encounter these transformative social structures. So they're the least capable of using them to their advantage in the case of conflict. But there certainly is a ferment and a hostility and a resistance among the peasant class that goes throughout the entire war, but is mostly after those initial rebellions are put down, takes the form of bandit resistance to the military authorities wherever they emerge, and the ambush and massacre of soldiers wherever they can be safely engaged with. But yeah, the organizing capacity to multiply the forces of the peasants just wasn't there.
I mean, to that, I would add and maybe ask, like, the access to the information infrastructure, I think, would be a big part of that, because, you know, we talk a lot about the organizational capacity that is offered by this new print culture around, which is largely centered in urban areas and appeals to and is shaped by, you know, the urban population. You know, in my mind, from what I have read, the fact that any kind of peasant resistance could not be shaped by both access to the organization of distributing information through a print culture and even consuming it through, you know, the educational attainment, although that is growing rapidly at this time, would be one of the limiting factors of putting together a coherent, organized, focused peasant resistance.
Speaking of mercenaries, let's get to our final hinge point, and that relates to Gustavus Adolphus not dying in 1632. So, what would you say we need to know about Gustavus Adolphus? He's more than just the name of a college that Steve Zahn went to in Minnesota. And why is he important? And what does his death shape, and what happens if he doesn't die? He's probably one of the most important figures in European history that not that many people know about. So maybe just say, who is this guy and why is he important?
Well, Gustavus Adolphus is the figure who is able to take his position as king of Sweden, which is a remote Baltic composite monarchy, Sweden and Finland and parts of the mainland Baltic across the ocean, with a claim to the throne of Poland that he pursues vigorously, but a very sparsely populated country at sort of the edge of Europe. But because of its compact social structure, very small and weak nobility, is able to command a very precocious state structure. Sweden, unlike any of the other major powers who fight in the 30 Years' War, is able to depend for their manpower on military conscription of their own population. They don't have to rely on mercenary captains who are basically using credit cards to get a bunch of guys together to go on campaign and then can't really pay them at that point. They're able to get a mechanism for bringing a percentage of their population into military service. And then once in that service, he utilizes a lot of the advances in military science, both technological and tactical, that had been developed by the fighting, specifically the Dutch had been doing during their War of Independence until that point. And the presence of this new, more dynamic military force immediately changes the entire course of the war. Until the arrival of the Swedes, the Protestant forces had been getting their asses kicked basically nonstop for a decade. But Gustavus shows up and has a few crushing victories and immediately starts rolling across Germany in this swath from the northeast to the southwest, and becomes, while doing so, the face of the Protestant cause, the Lion of the North, and the guy who a lot of people who had been prophesizing about a Protestant prince to come and redeem the continent, maybe they thought it was Frederick V. They realized, actually, never mind, it's Gustavus Adolphus. And at sort of the apogee of his power, he is killed at the Battle of Lutzen, because unlike many sovereigns of the time, he insisted on leading from the front, and also then proved why you don't do that. Well, it's a bad idea, because once he died, the momentum of the Swedish cause is blunted, and shortly after, the French are forced to come in formally and declare war on Spain and invade Germany. So yeah, he's incredibly important, because he's this figure who holds within his person all of these dramatic changes that are happening everywhere, but are only able to be concentrated at certain points. He is one of those concentrated points.
Yeah, a non-replacement figure, kind of, yeah.
Yeah. But I don't honestly know how much things would be different if he hadn't died, because in the process of accumulating all this power and influence to himself through his military victories, he was, of course, alienating his allies, because they had started the war to try to reduce the Habsburg authority. They did not want to replace that with the overweening power of the King of Sweden, even if he was a co-religionist in the case of the German princes. But and France specifically was getting very Richelieu in France was getting very anxious about Gustavus, because him becoming the all-powerful force in Central Europe didn't really help them either.
And towards the end of his life, again, after 1 year of campaign in Germany, Gustavus was musing aloud to people around him. Perhaps there could be a Swedish Holy Roman Emperor. So it was a live question of whether or not that he would be swapped in as the new dominating force in the empire. And then to that, you would add the addition of this rich Baltic trading empire that he was in the process of building north, which would be another economic engine that the Eastern Habsburgs, had not previously had access to. So it was a imagination of a reorientation of the power structure of the Holy Roman Empire in a way that could be perhaps even more dominant than the Habsburgs one. So again, the
well,
power
it
politics
creates a
comes
new
into play.
pole in northeastern
Yes,
Europe,
exactly.
a pole that never really existed, where you get a Sweden-inflected Holy Roman Empire. And the question then becomes, was Gustavus Adolphus talented enough, like a Charles Martel, to basically just take over a bunch of warring princes and affirm his authority? And to me, again, not an expert, it suggests that was a real live possibility. Even if people would have been able to rally against him, that he was such a singular individual and such a talented individual, both militarily and in terms of charisma, that he might have been able to relocate European power, again, northeast, which kind of returns to one of my initial questions about Western versus Eastern Europe. If you have a Gustavus Adolphus who basically pulls Europe further east, particularly northeast into Baltics, is he someone who then, invades the Muscovite kingdom or what would then become Russia, and kind of reorients all of world history to that land-based Eastern European empire that later people from Napoleon to Hitler were always trying to build to basically deal with, the Western powers' access to the New World?
I think even if he lives, the Swedes, I just don't think have the material base to sustain that kind of power. As I said, they're able to create this amazing military machine, but at the cost of depopulating an already thinly populated country. Like some parts of Sweden see their male populations drop by 40% as a result of military mobilization. And this is not a place that really has that much, to spare. And as I was saying, the more that Gustavus is aggrandized, the more every other power in Europe starts to see an interest in mobilizing and organizing against him. And so I think that some sort of there was going to be some sort of hard limit to how far the Swedes were going to be able to assert themselves before they provoked enough of a response that we could coordinate to neutralize them. And then they didn't have the material base to make up for that.
It is funny to imagine the possibility of Gustavus doing the Napoleon Hitler fail run in the exact same way.
That's what I always think about with him.
3 centuries earlier. Like if he survives it in 1632, takes Vienna in 1633, mobilizes the full force of the empire and is like, okay, now I'm going to press on and, exert my claims to Poland, which he had and was interested in, and basically try to do the invasion of Russia, and then just get totally bogged down there and collapse.
Yeah, what
and
could go wrong?
Yeah, exactly.
Russia. Absolutely.
Maybe that's how the Swedish empire eventually is annihilated. It basically bashes itself into pieces fighting Poland and Russia.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I would say not to further extol Gustavus, but people who are interested in like military history, when you hear people today talk about combined arms maneuvers, that's him. I mean, Napoleon learned from him, and it's all been kind of a straight line from there. Incredibly influential from that perspective.
He took the cannons and he put them in there with the infantry,
with the guys.
No, with the guys.
Yes, and we will talk about this at length in the show, but and then it is also funny that his army becomes a breeding ground for the most successful commanders that have wild influence in later parts of the story. Like basically every Scottish captain in the English Civil War who formed these, outsizedly powerful forces in Scotland are veterans of Gustavus Adolphus's army.
He's an Alexander-like figure in that regard, where he sort of subseeds these novel military techniques and technologies all over Europe and really changing the course. That's why I think that there's a world where he actually does pull a Charles Martel and he is talented and charismatic enough to take over the Holy Roman Empire. But that's just my crazy belief.
Well, all right, we gotta get a time machine and tell him don't go to Lutzen. Just chill.
Yeah, what are you doing, man?
Or do the brave leading your army in prayer in front of at the front lines while the bullets are already whizzing, and then maybe send in Benair to lead from the front. You can sit this one from the back. Say you got to look at some maps.
So guys, on that note, as we wrap up here, what do you want listeners to take away from this project or from the 30 Years' War? What should they know? Obviously, everyone check out Hell on Earth, of course, but in a little soundbite, what's your final thoughts? New rules.
Well, one thing that I got from making the show, as somebody who is captured by the same sort of pall that we're all under as overly informed people at a time of crisis that doesn't seem to be resolvable, is that the condition that feels terminal to us is in fact the chronic condition of humankind throughout history.
Yes. And perhaps this isn't the best thing that you want to, or the best thing that you want to take away from studying history. I guess the fantasy of studying history is that you're going to give yourself some kind of knowledge of the future. But I guess one of my takeaways is that all these people thought things were one way, and really it was another. And you know, and not in the way that they would expect, you know, not just like, oh, it's going to go the opposite of something. It's like the thing that was being built during this process is something that no one could have possibly imagined at the time. And we're most likely in the same way now. So we're setting up something that we will not be able to picture in the future.
Absolutely.
Well, on that
sounds exciting.
It's a note of hope.
Yeah, looking forward to
it. That's a good way to end. Usually we end on something super fucking depressing. Guys, thank you so much for joining us. Everyone, check out Hell on Earth. You all already listened to Chapo, and we'll see you all soon. Bye.
Bye.